There's a mistake that keeps showing up across every generation of personal finance. Not the same bad investment. Not the same overspending habit. Something deeper than that. Something that sits underneath all the specific decisions and quietly shapes them. And the strange part is, every generation thinks they've figured it out. Every generation looks at the one before them, spots the mistake, and genuinely believes they're doing it differently. Sometimes they are. But the underlying error? It travels. It just changes clothes. Let me explain what I mean. Your grandparents' generation had a saying that basically went, work hard, spend carefully, save what's left. And they meant it. Many of them lived through genuine scarcity. Frugality wasn't a lifestyle choice, it was survival memory. So they saved. They were disciplined. They kept money in the bank. But here's what a lot of them didn't do. They didn't put that money to work. Savings accounts, maybe some bonds, occasionally a pension if the employer offered one. The idea of regularly investing in markets felt speculative, risky, even irresponsible to a generation that had watched markets collapse and take everything with them. So what happened? They accumulated money, but it sat still. Inflation quietly ate into it year after year. And by the time retirement arrived, the money they'd carefully preserved over decades often wasn't enough, not because they'd spent it, but because they'd protected it so carefully that it never grew. The mistake wasn't recklessness. It was excessive caution dressed up as responsibility. Their children, the boomers, watched this and drew a conclusion. Don't just save. Own things. Property especially. Buy the house, build equity, let the asset appreciate. And honestly, for a long time, that worked spectacularly well. Property boomed. The strategy paid off. But something else happened alongside it. As incomes rose and assets grew, spending rose with them. Not recklessly, thoughtfully, even. A nicer car made sense because they could afford it. A bigger house made sense because the family needed space. A better holiday made sense because they'd worked hard. Each individual decision was completely reasonable. The problem was that every financial upgrade happened at roughly the same time as every income upgrade. So the gap between earning and spending, the gap that actually builds wealth, barely moved. Income went up. Lifestyle went up. Net savings rate stayed flat. And then the other issue, concentration. A lot of that generation ended up with most of their wealth locked in a single asset, the family home. Which is worth a lot on paper, but doesn't pay the electricity bill in retirement unless you sell it or borrow against it. They weren't careless. They just confused asset ownership with financial security. Those two things overlap, but they're not the same thing. Then came the generation that grew up watching all of this and said, we're going to be different. We saw what excessive caution did. We saw what property obsession did. We're going to be smarter, more flexible, more intentional. And in some ways, they were. They talked about money more openly. They questioned inherited assumptions. They pushed back on the idea that buying a house is always the right move, that a stable job at one company is always the goal, that following the conventional path is always the answer. But here's where it got complicated. When you reject the old roadmap without replacing it with a working one, you end up navigating without direction. And a lot of that generation, broadly speaking, ended up delaying the foundational financial moves. Not forever, but long enough for it to matter. Less invested in their 30s than the math required. Less cushion built up. More vulnerability to unexpected disruption. And some of that wasn't a choice, the economic conditions they entered genuinely were harder. But some of it was also a cultural permission slip to keep deferring the boring, uncomfortable work of actually building the foundation. Because the foundation isn't glamorous. It doesn't photograph well. And a whole culture grew up telling them that experiences matter more than structures. Experiences do matter. But experiences and structures aren't opposites. You can have both. The mistake was treating them as if they were. Now we're in the present. And the current generation coming into financial adulthood is, genuinely, the most financially literate group that has ever existed at that age. They grew up with information. They know what index funds are. They understand compound interest. They follow finance content creators. They talk about passive income and financial independence like it's normal conversation, because for them, it is. So you'd think the mistake would finally stop here. But there's a new version of it. And it's subtle precisely because it's wrapped in the right vocabulary. Knowing the concepts and actually executing on them, consistently, over years, without losing momentum, those are different skills. And the gap between financial literacy and financial behavior is real. You can understand compound interest completely and still not be investing enough to benefit from it. You can know exactly what a good savings rate looks like and still not be hitting it. You can talk fluently about wealth building while the actual numbers in your account don't yet reflect that fluency. This isn't unique to any one generation. But it shows up particularly sharply when financial education becomes content, something consumed and discussed rather than something applied and sustained. So what's the actual mistake? The one that travels through all of this? It's the gap between understanding what to do and actually doing it long enough for it to matter. Every generation has had access to enough information to make better decisions. Your grandparents knew that money sitting still loses value over time. Boomers knew that lifestyle inflation was a risk. Earlier millennials knew that property wasn't the only path to wealth. The knowledge was always partially there. The execution is what kept slipping. And the execution slips for the same reason every time, because the right financial behavior is almost always uncomfortable in the short term. Investing feels abstract until you've done it for years. Keeping your lifestyle below your income feels like deprivation when everyone around you is spending. Saying no to something today for the benefit of a version of yourself 15 years from now requires a kind of imagination that our brains aren't naturally wired for. We're wired to respond to what's immediate and visible. Wealth building is neither of those things for a very long time. The people who get this right, across every generation, in every era, tend to share one habit. They make the important financial behaviors automatic before they make them optimal. They don't wait until they've figured out the perfect investment strategy to start investing. They don't wait until they have surplus income to start saving. They set up the system first, even imperfectly, and then they improve it over time. The direct debit goes out before the money gets spent on something else. The contribution happens before the decision about whether to make it this month. Because the decision is the problem. Every time you have to make an active choice to do the right financial thing, you create an opportunity to not do it. Remove the decision. Automate it. Then live on what's left. That sounds simple, and it is simple. But simple isn't the same as easy. And the distance between knowing that and actually setting it up today, this week, not someday, that distance is exactly where the mistake lives. Every generation has had a reason why their version of the mistake was understandable. And honestly, most of those reasons were legitimate. The conditions were hard. The information wasn't there. The culture pushed in the wrong direction. The timing was bad. All of that can be true, and it still doesn't change what the numbers look like 20 years later. The question worth sitting with is a simple one. Between what you know you should be doing financially and what you're actually doing right now, how big is that gap? Not as a judgment. Just as an honest measurement. Because the mistake isn't a lack of knowledge. It hasn't been for a long time. It's the gap. And the gap closes one automated decision at a time.